Death by Meeting, a leadership fable about solving the most painful problem in business, by Patrick Lencioni. Picture this. You're sitting in a conference room, watching the clock on the wall like it's your sworn enemy. Someone's voice drones on in the background about quarterly metrics or workflow optimization, or some other phrase that makes your brain want to shut down and reboot. You glance around at your colleagues. They're nodding politely, but their eyes tell the truth. They're somewhere else entirely. Maybe on a beach, maybe at home, anywhere but here. You're not just bored. This is something deeper. This is a special kind of workplace torture that we've all somehow agreed to accept as normal. Welcome to the misery of the modern meeting. It's become such a universal experience that complaining about meetings is practically a professional bonding ritual. We joke about them, we dread them. We schedule meetings about how to have fewer meetings, which is its own special brand of irony. But here's where Patrick Lencioni, the author we're diving into today, throws us a curveball. He asks us to imagine a surgeon saying, I'd really love this job if I didn't have to do all this surgery. Or a professional athlete complaining, football would be perfect if we could just skip the actual games. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, here's the uncomfortable truth. When leaders and managers complain about meetings, they're saying exactly the same thing. For people who lead teams, meetings aren't an annoying distraction from the real work. Meetings are the work. They're the operating room where critical decisions get made. They're the playing field where leadership actually happens. So if we despise them, if we find them soul-crushing and pointless, how can we possibly be steering our organizations towards success? Spoiler alert, we can't. Bad meetings lead to bad decisions, and bad decisions are the express lane to mediocrity. But what if there was another way? What if we could transform the most dreaded part of our work week into something powerful, energizing, and dare I say it, actually useful? Today, we're stepping into a story. It's about a guy named Casey McDaniel, a genuinely good person running a pretty good company that was slowly dying of boredom. His journey is like looking in a mirror, one that might show us our own frustrations reflected back. But more importantly, it reveals a secret, a counterintuitive approach to rescuing our work, our teams, and maybe even our sanity from death by meeting. By the time we're done, you won't just see meetings differently. You'll understand why they fail on a psychological level, and you'll have the keys to turning them into your most powerful leadership tool. Our story opens with a man on the edge of panic. Casey McDaniel is about to walk into a meeting that he's convinced will determine whether his career, his company, and his financial future survive or crash and burn. He feels physically sick, wondering how everything went sideways so fast. To understand Casey's fear, you need to understand who he is. By all accounts, Casey was an extraordinary human being, but only an average chief executive. Everyone genuinely liked the guy. He was a devoted family man, involved in his community, the kind of friend who showed up when you needed help. It was almost impossible not to admire him, which made his shortcomings as a leader all the more puzzling. Casey built his company, Yip Software, from nothing. He'd been a college golfer whose professional dreams died when he developed the yips, that nerve-wracking condition where you suddenly can't make a simple putt to save your life. So he channeled that energy into his other passion, computers. He created the most realistic golf video game anyone had ever seen. Thanks to his deep knowledge of the sport and a lucky endorsement from a pro golfer buddy, Yip Software became a massive hit. Over 10 years, the company grew to nearly 200 employees, housed in a gorgeous historic building in Monterey, California. Yip was the town's pride and joy, profitable and award-winning. From the outside, it looked like the American dream come true. But something was off on the inside. The company was an underachiever, and it started at the top. Casey was content with just getting by. As long as the quarterly numbers worked out and he could squeeze in a few rounds of golf, he was happy. His employees picked up on this vibe. They knew the company would always hit its targets, but just barely. For a place that made fun, cutting-edge video games, there was a surprising lack of excitement. A subtle mediocrity had settled over everything like dust. If you wanted to find the source of this malaise, you just needed to attend the weekly executive staff meeting. These meetings were a ritualized form of suffering, lethargic, unfocused, devoid of passion. The executive team knew their weekly gathering was tedious, but they'd accepted it as a necessary evil of doing business. What they didn't realize was that the entire company culture had started to mirror those meetings. Every important topic, from marketing strategy to competitive threats, got dragged into that room where it was stripped of all energy and momentum before drifting away, unresolved. This might have continued forever, but life has a way of shaking things up. The first domino fell when Michelle, the new head of human resources, presented survey results showing that employees were largely, quote, unconcerned about the business. This rattled the executives. Suddenly, everyone had theories. The product development head thought people were burned out. The sales leader argued they needed new markets. But Tim, the chief financial officer, voiced the most sensitive theory. After years of winning awards, maybe employees were wondering where their financial upside was. This struck a nerve with Casey. He'd always prided himself on taking care of his people, and the thought that they felt shortchanged was painful. For the first time, he wondered if he was letting them down. So in a moment, fueled by guilt and good intentions, Casey made an announcement he'd soon regret. He was taking the company public to give his people the financial payoff they deserved. But then what seemed like an easier path appeared, like a mirage in the desert. The call came from J.T. Harrison, head of business development at PlaySoft, the nation's second-largest video game maker. PlaySoft was built on games for kids and wanted to break into the adult sports market where Yip dominated. They saw Yip as underperforming, which meant cheap. Casey, wary of typical game companies, agreed to sell but only under 3 conditions. He'd run Yip autonomously, keep his management team intact, and maintain the Yip brand. To his surprise, PlaySoft immediately agreed. Casey thought he'd found the perfect solution: financial wins for his employees without losing control of what he'd built. He couldn't have been more wrong. For a few glorious weeks after the deal closed, Yip employees were giddy with their new paper wealth. And then, the market collapsed. PlaySoft stock plummeted. The mood in the office dropped lower than it had been in years. The financial windfall evaporated like morning fog. That's when Casey got the second call from J.T. Harrison. No sympathy in his voice, just a cold, simple request. I'd like to come out and see you next week. Just thought I'd drop by and sit in on your staff meeting. Casey tried to deflect, suggesting a one-on-one instead, but Harrison insisted. As he hung up the phone, Casey could hear the faint sound of his world beginning to crumble. The day of the meeting, J.T. Harrison arrived like an inspector from headquarters. Casey started the meeting his usual way, half joking that no one had sent him agenda items. He passed out the agenda he'd created himself: expense policies, strategic planning, management training, and a few other items. What followed was a masterclass in mediocrity. For the next hour, the team had a passionless discussion about expense reports. JT seemed to mentally check out completely. Then they moved to the strategic plan. The conversation was slightly more interesting, touching on competitive pressures and market trends. But JT noticed something crucial was missing: passion, urgency. It sounded like they were discussing a case study about someone else's company, not their own survival. The only animated moment in the entire 2 hours happened near the end, when the sales head brought up magazine advertising they thought they'd already settled last week. For a brief, shining moment, there was actual energy as they debated ad spend timing. But just as quickly, Casey shut it down. "Okay, we have 5 minutes left," he announced. "And we haven't even talked about management training, stock reporting, or competitive analysis." In a frantic rush to the finish line, they glossed over 3 massive topics in under 5 minutes. The chief financial officer gave a 30-second warning about potential Securities and Exchange Commission violations. Casey relayed a message about a mandatory 3-day training seminar, leaving no time for questions or objections. And with the clock ticking, he asked for the competitive report. They learned that 2 major competitors were launching new games aimed directly at stealing their market share. "So what do we do?" someone asked. Casey looked at his watch. We talk about it next time. It's noon. And just like that, meeting over. People scattered like kids at recess. JT watched them leave, amazed. He just witnessed a team of competent executives sit through 2 hours of mind-numbing conversation, touch on critical topics, and then let them drift away without the slightest hint of frustration. What he didn't know was that real decisions at Yip were never made in meetings. They were made later, in one-on-one sessions in Casey's office. The meeting itself was just a tedious formality. A few days later, the real blow came, not from Harrison himself, but from one of his young assistants. The message was chillingly corporate. J.T. Harrison would be attending their staff meetings for the rest of the summer to get more acquainted with the business. He might pop in unannounced. Casey knew exactly what this meant. It was an invasion. A hostile takeover in slow motion. Just as this professional crisis hit, a personal one followed. Gia, his loyal assistant, tearfully announced she was pregnant with twins and had to go on immediate bed rest. Casey was happy for her, but a voice screamed in his mind, "What am I going to do?" He was losing one of the few stable people in his life at the worst possible moment. It was Casey's wife, Patricia, who planted the seed of an idea. "Don't just get a temp," she suggested. "Find someone different, someone who can add value in a new way." And then, through sheer luck, a solution appeared. An old family friend, Ken Peterson, reached out to arrange dinner. At that dinner, while Casey was reluctantly recounting his troubles, Patricia mentioned his need for a temporary assistant. Ken had an idea. "You know who would be great for this? Will." Will Peterson was Ken's son, 27 years old, brilliant, and a little lost. He had degrees in psychology, business, and film, had worked in advertising, and was now trying to figure out if he wanted to be on the creative or business side of Hollywood. His mother described him as someone who could create order out of chaos. His father said he was the hardest worker he'd ever known. He was massively overqualified, but he was out of money and needed a break. It seemed like a perfect, if unusual, fit. Casey hired him. What he didn't know was that he wasn't just hiring an administrative assistant. He was hiring a catalyst. Because Will had a secret. From a young age, Will had suffered from a psychological disorder, something like Tourette's syndrome or obsessive-compulsive disorder, that caused him to blurt out inappropriate, brutally honest comments at the worst possible times. For years, medication had controlled it, allowing him to become disciplined and well-liked. But just 3 weeks before his interview with Casey, Will had decided to stop taking his medication, wanting to see if he could manage the disorder on his own. In a few weeks, the full effects would return. On his first real day of work, Will walked in to find Casey sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen, almost catatonic. After a long silence, Casey finally looked up and confessed. He showed Will the email he'd just received from J.T. Harrison. Will read the message. It was a smoking gun. J.T. got right to the point. "I'm having doubts about your ability to run your division, but mostly it has to do with my visit a few weeks ago. I have rarely seen such an unproductive, uninspired meeting in my career. This absurdly boring meeting was no longer just a symptom of mediocrity. It was now the evidence that could cost Casey his job and his company." At that moment, Will Peterson decided he'd do whatever it took to help this good man save his life's work. Will sat in on the next Monday meeting, determined to observe. It was a sequel to the horror show JT had witnessed. The meeting started 12 minutes late. The first 15 minutes were spent debating the location of the summer picnic. Then came a 30-minute presentation on management training that no one paid attention to. An hour was spent on the budget, including a 10-minute debate over whether to buy a paper shredder to save $72 a month. Will took constant copious notes, not to record minutes, but as a coping mechanism to keep himself from losing his mind. Finally, with only a half hour left, they got to something that actually mattered, a presentation from Connor, the head of marketing, about rebranding the company to fight off new competition. It was fascinating and critical. Will was completely hooked. But then Tim, the chief financial officer, interrupted to ask about the budget. The conversation immediately derailed from strategy into a pointless discussion about departmental budget allocations for the picnic. It was at that moment that Will's pen ran out of ink. His last defense was gone. The disorder, the honesty, the unfiltered truth came rushing out. He spoke up, his voice cutting through the haze of complacency. "Excuse me, but does anyone else think we should finish talking about rebranding this company before we waste another precious hour in pointless discussion about the picnic?" The room went dead silent. Will, horrified at what he'd done, tried to stop, but he couldn't. "I'm sorry, but these meetings are amazing," he continued, the words tumbling out. "You guys spend more time getting less done and avoiding anything remotely interesting." Everyone stared, stunned. Casey, seeing the shock on everyone's faces, quickly called for a 10-minute break, leaving him alone in the room with Will. When the door closed, Will looked up, expecting to be fired, but Casey was smiling. "Wow," he said. "Where did that come from?" Will confessed everything: the disorder, the medication, his struggle to contain himself. Casey listened with remarkable kindness and understanding. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. Maybe he was actually relieved. The truth, however bluntly it had arrived, was finally on the table. The unspoken disaster of their meetings had finally been spoken. And in that moment of chaos, created by a brilliant assistant with a psychological disorder, the possibility of change was finally born. Patrick Lencioni's Fable hit so hard because, on some level, we've all been Casey McDaniel. We've all sat in those lifeless rooms, feeling our will to live drain away. We've seen important topics get pushed to the end of the agenda and then rushed through in the final minutes. We've endured pointless debates about trivial matters, while the real, high-stakes issues go unaddressed. The genius of death by meeting is that it frames this universal frustration not as a minor annoyance, but as a critical leadership failure. A company's culture, Lencioni shows us, is a direct reflection of its meetings. If your meetings are boring, your company will be boring. If they're unfocused, your company will be unfocused. If they're devoid of healthy conflict and passion, your organization will be a place of quiet, polite mediocrity. The core lesson from the book is that we've been thinking about meetings all wrong. We treat them as a single, monolithic activity. We cram everything: strategic brainstorming, tactical updates, administrative announcements, and everything in between, into one weekly staff meeting, and then wonder why it's a disaster. Lencioni argues that our meetings fail for two fundamental reasons. First, they lack drama, not melodrama, but legitimate, focused conflict. A good meeting, like a good movie, needs stakes. It needs a central question that people actually care about solving. Most meetings are like movies with no plot. The second reason they fail is because they lack contextual structure. We're trying to do too many different kinds of work in one setting. It's like trying to cook a gourmet dinner, change the oil in your car, and file your taxes all on the same kitchen table at the same time. You're bound to make a mess. So how do we begin to fix this? The story of Casey and Will gives us the starting point. Here are a few simple actions you can take, inspired by their journey. First, just acknowledge the pain. The turning point in the story is when Will has his outburst. He says the one thing everyone's thinking, but no one is brave enough to say. The first step to fixing your meetings is to have an honest conversation with your team. Ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad are our meetings, and why? Just putting the truth on the table can be revolutionary. Second, find the drama. Before your next meeting, ask yourself, what is the single most important issue we're facing as a team right now? Is it a competitive threat? A new opportunity? A project that's falling behind? Structure the meeting around that central, dramatic question. Give your team a compelling reason to be engaged. Don't let them discuss picnic logistics when the future of the company is at stake. And third, start to separate your concerns. Look at your agenda. Is this a tactical meeting to review progress and clear obstacles? Or is this a strategic meeting to debate the future? Lencioni's full model, which he explains after the Fable, provides a brilliant framework for different kinds of meetings, each with its own purpose, timing, and structure. You don't need to implement his whole system overnight. Just start by recognizing that a single meeting can't be all things to all people. In the end, Casey McDaniel's journey wasn't just about learning a new format for meetings. It was about waking up. It was about a leader realizing that the activity he dreaded most was actually the most important thing he did. The heart of any team, any department, any company beats strongest in the room where its leaders gather to make decisions, solve problems, and fight for a common cause. Lencioni's powerful story asks us a simple question. Is that heartbeat strong, passionate, and clear, or is it slowly, quietly, fading away? That was a summary of Death by Meeting by Patrick Lencioni. We've explored the core of the story today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only take you so far. The real magic of this book is in feeling the story unfold and then connecting it to the practical, actionable model that Lencioni lays out in the second half. It's in those quiet moments when a piece of dialogue or a simple insight hits you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, I truly encourage you to grab a copy, because reading it isn't just about learning. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you lead and work. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these journeys are making a difference, and it ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.